Welcome to Lecture 5. This is the first week of Module 2, and in Module 2 we'll be dealing with the police. In Lesson 3, your readings briefly describe the policing enterprise in the United States. So you should already be somewhat familiar with the development of the police and the number and types of law enforcement agencies and things of that nature. This week, however, we will examine the role of the police in modern American society. If you ask a typical person about the role of the police, law enforcement will likely be the focus of their answer. But what duties does society call on the police to actually perform? Well, numerous studies have examined citizen calls for service to the police. These studies are old and new. They're as old as the 1960s and as recent as the late 2000s. They have examined urban jurisdictions, suburban jurisdictions, and rural jurisdictions, and they all find almost identical results. Across all these studies, only 20 to 30% of calls for service to the police involve any sort of violation of the criminal law. Among these crime-related calls, less than a quarter involve a felony offense. So only about 20 to 30% of calls to the police for service involve any type of crime, and of those crimes, more than 75% that are called in regarding misdemeanors. So public drunkenness, drunk driving, shoplifting, graffiti, so minor property damage, things like that. So when we talk about law enforcement as the primary role of the police, it neglects 70 to 80% of not just what the police do, but what society expects the police to do, based on the calls for service to the police. Now you can recall from Module 1 that these are the functions the police play within the criminal justice process and the criminal justice system. They investigate crimes, they arrest criminal offenders, and they help book and process those offenders. But we got to keep in mind that the criminal justice system is only one component of the responsibilities of the police. Frequently, the layperson thinks of the police as wholly within the sphere of the criminal justice system, and it's not. It's also, I'd say, at least equally, if not more so, within the sphere of the social service system. And then it also has responsibilities outside those two systems as well. So all of these studies that looked at citizen calls for service to the police found that between 70 and 80% of the citizen calls for service involve order maintenance or service-related issues. Order maintenance issues would be situations that disturb the peace, that bother people enough that they would call the police over being disturbed about something going on, but that issue is not a violation of the criminal law. So, for example, dispute between neighbors, for instance. One neighbor's dog poops in the other neighbor's yard and he refuses to pick it up. That's not a violation of the law, but when they're arguing back and forth, it may create a disturbance in the neighborhood, and one of the parties may call the police, or a third party may call the police because of all the arguing going on. Noise complaints. Most communities have noise ordinances. You can't play your stereo loud or use your jackhammer or your circular saw, but usually it's only after a certain period in the evening, like for instance after 11 p.m. So during the day, that's not even an ordinance violation when you're making noise, but it may disturb your neighbors enough that they would call the police. Mentally ill persons, even though they're not breaking the law, people might find them scary or bothering their business to have a homeless mentally ill person sitting outside while you're trying to run a store. Animal complaints, so loose animals or an animal that's been injured. Even traffic enforcement, even though speeding and illegal turns are violations of the law, those are traffic laws. Those are still part of the order maintenance function. Then there's service-related duties. Service-related duties are things that are not violations of the law, and they're not order maintenance duties. So it's a kind of a catch-all category. And service-related duties can be giving advice or directions, providing accident reports. When you have an automobile accident, that's got nothing to do with the law unless a violation occurred, but in a lot of accidents, a violation didn't occur. So this is a service function. The reason you need an accident report is for your insurance agency. So the police, as a courtesy, provide a report for your insurance company. So missing or lost persons, death notifications, if you have a loved one that died in another jurisdiction, for instance, maybe you have a relative that lives out of state and that person died in an automobile accident, the police can be contacted to come tell you that your loved one has died. Assisting with medical assistance, stranded motorists, broken down on the side of the road, all those things involve service-related duties. So order maintenance and service-related duties make up 3/4 or more of what the police actually do. Well, unfortunately, both for officers and society, we train and we evaluate our police officers based almost entirely on their crime-fighting role. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, if you ask the average person what do the police do, and law enforcement would be the first things that come to mind. Yet we as society call upon them to do a myriad of other duties. Then we criticize them for not doing a good job at fighting crime or giving service. One more important thing to remember is that there is also abundant evidence that the primary factors influencing crime, such as poor parenting, mental illness, poverty, unemployment, lack of education, are well beyond the control of the police. The police, comparatively to these other things, can do only a little to actually reduce crime. Nevertheless, the police are public servants, and they do attempt to address crime and do encounter quite a bit of it. So police officers and police agencies try to define themselves in terms of their crime-fighting role and downplay their social and community service roles. Part of the reason for that is it's so much easier to define yourself as a crime fighter. You can measure crime, whether it went up or went down, a lot easier than you can all these service-related functions. Plus, society, labels police officers as crime fighters, so it's easier to fit into that role. So, when you read the readings for this week, keep in mind the conflict between the roles and responsibilities of the police and what society calls on them to do, and these conflicting roles of law enforcement, order maintenance, and service. And that order maintenance and service are the majority of what they do, but the majority of what we think about the police is actually that law enforcement function. So the first article is a chapter called Good Policing by James Fife. James Fife is a very well-known scholar, major researcher in the area of policing. He died just a few years ago, but he's a PhD from SUNY Albany. He had been at American University. He had been at Temple University. He'd been at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. But in addition to that, he spent 27 years as a law enforcement officer of the New York City Police Department. And when he retired, he was the commander of their police academy. So in his chapter, he's talking about this conflicting role of the police, and that the police basically do what nobody else does. They get stuck with all the responsibilities that there's no other agency to function to do that, so it gets lumped onto the police. And we need to keep that in mind when we evaluate how the police do their job, or are they doing their job. And it's based on all these things that we put upon them as responsibilities and roles that we expect them to fill. The next reading is one of my favorite articles. It's I Don't Prevent Crime, I Prevent Calls, Policing as Negotiated Order by Albert Meehan. Albert Meehan is a sociologist and ethnographer who studied police around the Boston area. He's now at Oakland University in the sociology department up in Michigan. And this article really shows how responsive the police are to society's requests. It is a democratic government. It's a democratic agency. You may not like the response that you get, but the police still are responding to the requests of citizens. This theme is continued in the third reading, a book chapter called 911 is a Joke, written by Peter Muskos. Peter Muskos is a very interesting character. He was a Ivy League college student, and he was getting his PhD in sociology and anthropology at Harvard University. And for his dissertation, he decided to study the police and to study them firsthand. So he became a Baltimore police officer. He went through the police academy and then spent a year as a patrol officer. And during that time, he was collecting data for his dissertation. And the book he wrote, Cop in the Hood, is his doctoral dissertation. And this chapter comes out of that book. And then the last reading doesn't come from an academic, comes from a journalist. This is a chapter called The Street, out of a book called What Cops Know, written by Connie Fletcher. Connie Fletcher was a Chicago Tribune reporter for a number of years, and her father and most of her uncles and even brothers became Chicago police officers. So this chapter is a reminder that after we've just had previous readings that are really emphasizing the order maintenance role of the police and the service role of the police, it is a good reminder to remember that they also do have a dangerous job and that they do engage in crime enforcement. And this chapter is a bunch of recollections of Chicago police officers and individual stories from about 30 different police officers about what their job is really like. So don't forget Quiz 5, and if you have any questions, concerns as you go through the readings, please feel free to email me.